Okay, so, we always appreciate it when you send us stuff that you find interesting. You definitely sent us something a little bit thought-provoking this time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so this is excerpts from a piece called The Use of Ideology to Divide a Country and Sabotage the Economy, which is quite a title.
It is a bit of a mouthful, isn't it?
It is a bit of a mouthful. I mean, right off the bat, you sort of know where the author's coming from a little bit.
Yeah.
And it's by Nnaemeka Udoka.
That's right.
So the goal today is to kind of go through this and to figure out, what are the insights that we can glean from it about exactly what the title suggests.
Yeah, how ideology is being used, or at least portrayed as being used, to create these divisions and to negatively impact the Canadian economy.
Yeah, and I mean, right in the author's note right up front, Udoka really lays out his central concern, right?
Yeah, he does. And I think it's something that a lot of Canadians can maybe relate to. This idea that Canada is, increasingly divided and that, we seem to be struggling economically despite all of our, potential.
Right.
And his argument is that a lot of that stems from, prioritizing ideology over practicality.
Yeah.
And, that's kind of fracturing our unity and creating this environment where it's really difficult to have, productive conversations and to find common ground.
Right. And so, he uses this phrase, ideological warfare.
Right.
Which sounds a little, dramatic.
Yeah, a little bit.
Maybe a little intense, but what did you understand to mean by that? What are the consequences?
So when I read that, what I took away from it is that it's not necessarily like a physical war,
right?
But rather this sort of battle of ideas where you have these different groups or institutions that are really pushing their ideologies.
Right.
And they're doing it in a way that's, sometimes quite aggressive.
Okay.
And, it creates this kind of like us versus them mentality. And, I think that that's something that we see playing out, in a lot of different areas of society.
Absolutely.
And the consequences that he lays out are, pretty significant. Increased social discord, less attractiveness to investors.
Yeah.
A real, stifling of innovation. Yeah. And all of this really kind of creates a lot of headwinds for businesses to try to succeed.
Okay. And he doesn't waste any time in getting into specifics.
No, he doesn't.
And the first place he goes, it really, I think, stood out to me in this piece, was the energy sector.
Yeah. And it's a really interesting one.
Yeah. So he talks about Canada, having these vast reserves of oil and natural gas. We all know this.
Yeah.
But he says that we're really hamstrung because of ideological battles, particularly around environmental policies.
Right.
And that this is really impacting our economy in a negative way.
And he makes a really interesting comparison, I think, to Norway, a country that also has, huge reserves of oil and gas. But they've seemed to find a way to kind of balance that economic development with environmental stewardship.
Right.
A little bit better than we have.
Yeah, and it's interesting that he also points out that, Canada's had to lobby the U.S. on energy matters because of being, I think the term he uses is boxed in.
Boxed in by ideology.
By ideology, yeah.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a really interesting way of putting it.
It is, yeah.
So it's like we're limited in our strategic options.
Yeah, exactly.
Because of the way we're thinking about this ideologically as opposed to perhaps more practically.
Right.
And then he shifts gears and he starts talking about housing affordability, which is something that, is a huge issue.
Yeah, top of mind for a lot of Canadians right now.
Top of mind for so many people. And again, his argument is that ideological approaches are actually making the problem worse.
Right. And, I think a lot of people would agree that there's a real crisis going on when it comes to housing affordability. Yeah.
And so the question becomes, are the policies that are being implemented actually effective?
Yeah.
And his perspective is that instead of addressing the root causes of the issue, things like insufficient supply, overly complicated regulations, restrictive zoning, the focus has been more on what he calls these Band-Aid solutions, like rent control, tweaking property taxes.
Yeah.
And he argues that those types of policies are often driven by ideology and that they're not really getting at the heart of the matter.
Right. And so then he goes on to connect this with immigration policy. And he argues that, large-scale immigration is putting additional pressure on the housing market.
Right. And, he frames it in a way where it's not necessarily against immigration, but rather that it's about the scale and the pace of immigration relative to our ability to actually accommodate those newcomers.
Particularly when it comes to housing and other essential services.
Right.
So it's, again, this idea that, ideological goals might be sort of overshadowing those practical considerations.
Right. Okay, so the next section I found really interesting was about the media.
Yes, this is a big one.
And information control. And he sees this as being a critical element in this ideological warfare that he's outlining.
Absolutely. And he specifically mentions the CBC as an example of a government-funded media outlet. And his concern is that can lead to, a certain bias in the information that's being presented to the public. And that, there may be a lack of, alternative viewpoints being given a platform. So it's kind of this idea of creating a narrative that supports a certain ideology.
Yeah, and this leads into the next point about free speech, which is obviously a very, hot topic these days.
Yeah, and he argues that there's been a real chilling effect on open discussion. And he points to instances where people are being labeled as, extremists or being, canceled just for questioning, certain policies or ideas.
Yeah, or even just for having a different opinion.
Exactly. And so he brings up things like Bill C-11 and C-18 as examples of, legislation that some people are concerned about in terms of, government overreach and potentially censorship.
So just as a reminder for people listening, C-11 was dealing with online streaming platforms.
Yeah, making sure that they're contributing to Canadian content.
Exactly.
And then C-18, the Online News Act, which was aimed at supporting Canadian news outlets in their negotiations with these big online platforms. So, there are definitely concerns there about the potential impact on free expression and access to information.
Yeah, absolutely. And then he ties this into economic impacts. He says that when you stifle open debate, you stifle the exchange of ideas, you ultimately hinder innovation. And that leads to economic stagnation.
Because if you're not allowing people to, challenge the status quo and come up with new ideas, how are you going to progress as a society?
And then he goes into some specific examples of how he believes that this is having an impact. And one that really stood out was the way that small businesses were disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 lockdowns.
And I think a lot of people have really felt that. Those small businesses were often forced to close while larger corporations, were able to kind of weather the storm a bit better.
And he argues that this is because they have the scale and the resources to kind of pivot and adapt.
And also, a lot of them were considered essential services. So they were able to stay open.
And then on top of that, he points out that as things started to open back up, many small businesses were, saddled with this huge amount of debt. And then faced with these increased operating costs.
Things like minimum wage going up. New taxes being introduced.
So it's just made it even harder.
Really difficult for them to recover.
And then the final economic area he looks at is the labor market, and specifically the emphasis on DEI.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Which is obviously a very important topic.
It is a huge topic right now.
Huge topic, and he has a very particular take on it.
And it's important to note that he's not necessarily arguing against the principles of DEI, but rather his concern is that the way it's being implemented in some cases is leading to hiring and promotion decisions being made based on what he calls ideological quotas, rather than on merit.
So, and he defines those ideological quotas as...
Well, he's suggesting that there's this rigid adherence to specific demographic targets, and that might be overshadowing, a more holistic approach to creating inclusive workplaces.
And he thinks that this ultimately will affect our global competitiveness.
Because if you're not, hiring the best people for the job, regardless of their background, then, how can you expect to compete?
Okay, so tying all of this together, what would you say is Udoka's main argument in this piece?
I think his central argument is that we need to shift away from governing based on ideology and move towards a more pragmatic approach.
Okay.
One that's focused on economic realities. And also, I think on a sense of shared national identity.
Yeah.
He talks about the need to foster innovation, encourage investment support, entrepreneurship. And, he sees a lot of the, taxation and regulation and, some of these social policies as being very burdensome and divisive.
Yeah. And he has a pretty clear call to action for Canadians, doesn't he?
He does, yeah.
What does he want us to do?
Well, he really wants Canadians to kind of wake up and be aware of what he sees as, this ideological manipulation that's happening. He wants us to hold our elected officials accountable.
Okay.
To really evaluate the information that we're getting from the media. And, he also talks about the role of universities.
Right.
And how he feels like they've moved away from being, centers for critical thinking.
Right.
And have become more places of, ideological indoctrination.
Okay. And he asked some really thought-provoking questions, I think.
He does, yeah.
Like, can Canada be both environmentally responsible and economically prosperous? Can we be inclusive without sacrificing meritocracy?
Yeah.
Can we be compassionate but also fiscally responsible? These are really big questions.
Yeah.
I think he believes that answering yes to those questions requires us to kind of break free from this ideological grip.
Right. Okay. So that sets the stage for us.
It does. So everyone listening now, we're going to really dig into some of these key areas that Udoka highlights.
Right. Let's do it.
And try to give you a little bit of a deeper understanding of some of these issues.
Okay. So let's wrap up our exploration of Udoka's argument by bringing together some of the main threads.
Sounds good.
So he really paints this picture of a Canada where ideology has become kind of a tool, almost a weapon, you could say, in the hands of the government.
Right.
And he suggests that, policies are often crafted to benefit those who align with a particular ideology.
Okay.
While, maybe disadvantaging those who hold different views.
And he gives a specific example.
He does. He talks about the oil exports from Alberta and Newfoundland.
Right.
And how they might be treated differently compared to, say, coal exports from BC.
Right. So it's like there's this unequal playing field.
Exactly. Yeah.
Depending on your ideological alignment. Okay, and then he goes on to argue that this is not just limited to the political realm, but it also spills over into media and academia.
Yeah, absolutely. He talks about this chilling effect on open and honest debate. And he particularly calls out cancel culture as being a big problem.
Yeah, and he uses his own experiences as well as some other high-profile cases.
He does. He mentions Jordan Peterson
right.
As an example of this.
Yeah, and then he draws a connection between identity politics and social division. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I think his point is that when we focus too much on our differences, whether it's, race, gender, or political affiliation, it can create this us versus them dynamic.
Right.
And that ultimately undermines our sense of shared national identity.
Okay, so moving on, he talks about the exploitation of crises.
Yeah, this is an interesting one.
To advance ideological agendas. And he specifically points to the government's response to the pandemic.
Right.
And the use of the Emergencies Act during the Freedom Convoy.
Right, and he also reminds us of the judicial rulings that came out of that, which maybe question the validity of some of those actions.
Okay, and then he goes on to talk about media echo chambers. And this idea that we're all kind of trapped in our own little bubbles.
Right, and that, both traditional media and social media algorithms are kind of reinforcing our existing beliefs and limiting our exposure to different perspectives.
Yeah, which obviously can lead to polarization.
Exactly.
Okay, and then he dives into DEI initiatives. And he raises some concerns about how they're being implemented.
Yeah, his argument is that in some cases, these initiatives are actually prioritizing things other than merit.
Right.
And he even brings up the possibility of reverse discrimination.
Right.
As a potential consequence.
And he really emphasizes the economic consequences of some of the current climate policies.
Yeah, he talks about the impact of the carbon tax across various sectors of the economy.
Right.
The challenges of transitioning to green energy, the effects on the oil and gas and manufacturing industries.
Yeah.
He really kind of paints a picture of, some of the economic downsides of those policies.
And then he looks at government spending and the welfare state. And he uses programs like CEOB
right.
as an example.
Yeah, and he raises the question of whether or not these programs are actually disincentivizing people to work.
Right, and he keeps coming back to the media.
He does.
And he suggests that it plays a major role in this ideological manipulation.
Yeah, and he expresses concern about, things like state-funded media censorship, cancel culture, the suppression of dissenting voices.
Right.
He even draws a pretty strong parallel to Nazi Germany.
Oh.
In terms of propaganda.
Yeah, that's a bold statement.
It is, yeah. But, he's trying to make a point about the dangers of, controlling information.
Right.
And, he mentions Bills C-18 and C-63 as, legislative examples of this.
Right. And he also doesn't let academia off the hook.
No, he doesn't.
He argues that there's been this decline in critical thinking, this marginalization of diverse viewpoints.
Yeah, and the rise of things like safe spaces and trigger warnings.
Right.
Which he sees as contributing to this kind of homogenization of discourse. And, he believes that this ultimately impacts the quality of education and, the kind of leaders that we're producing.
And then he brings it all back to the economic fallout
right.
of all of these, ideological policies.
He talks about political instability, declining global competitiveness, the worsening housing crisis, rising inflation, the struggles of small businesses.
Right.
He really paints a pretty bleak picture of the economic situation.
And the impact of these ideologically driven immigration policies.
Yeah, he argues that, this rapid influx of people is putting a strain on our public services.
Right.
And exacerbating the housing crisis.
Okay, so with all that said, what is Udoka's proposed solution to all of this?
Well, his vision for a better Canada really centers on a return to what he calls economic sanity.
Okay.
He advocates for things like tax reform, streamlining regulations.
Okay.
Fostering public-private partnerships, encouraging entrepreneurship.
Right.
And, really just a more common sense approach to governance.
Okay.
That's focused on, the needs of the citizens rather than on ideology.
And he also talks about the need for national unity.
Absolutely.
How does he see us achieving that?
Well, he really calls for, open and respectful dialogue.
Okay.
Education that promotes critical thinking, celebrating our shared Canadian identity.
Right.
And really trying to bridge those regional divides.
Yeah. And he finishes by emphasizing free speech.
Right.
And balanced leadership. And integrity in media and academia.
Yeah, those are kind of his pillars
right.
for a healthy democracy.
Okay, so you listening out there, I'd love for you to think about some of these specific Canadian policies that we've discussed as you're going about your day-to-day life.
Yeah.
Do you think that the main driver behind them is practical problem solving, or is it ideology?
Good question.
And then what does the evidence suggest about their actual impact on the lives of everyday Canadians?
Right.
So we encourage you to go and explore some of these topics in more depth.
Yeah, definitely lots to think about.
Yeah.
Lots to unpack.
Absolutely. All right, well, thanks for joining us today for another deep dive.
It was a pleasure.
Always good talking to you.
Likewise.
Okay, we'll see you next time.
See you later.